Hey, everybody. I'm Margaret Ritsch with the Strategic Communication program here at Murrow College. It's my first year at the university and with the Murrow Symposium. Really excited to be here for this really important session on strategic communication, on crisis communication and strategic communication. We've got two incredible experts in the field who are going to be speaking with us today. The first speaker is Rita Kepner. Dr. Kepner earned her Ph.D. here at Murrow College and did her dissertation on crisis communication, reviewing the lack of efficiency in the emergency alert system. Dr. Kepner spent years in the field as a disaster responder before coming to WSU to teach and earn her advanced degree. She's really been involved in some of the worst disasters in the country, worked really as a communicator in more than 70 situations, including Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the Joplin, Missouri tornado, and fires and earthquakes throughout California. In her last deployment, she was actually in Puerto Rico during the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Dr. Kepner remains a reservist with Homeland Security and FEMA. Our second speaker is Gavin Mathis, 2011 WSU graduate. Gavin is a vice president of Methods Communication, an agency in Salt Lake City, and his work with clients in the technology field and financial services, energy, and healthcare sectors really moves the needle for these organizations. Gavin has spent more than a decade in public relations, marketing, and public policy. In Washington, D.C., worked for several years at Edelman, one of the nation's most prominent PR firms. He also worked for the U.S. Senate as a press associate early in his career. He majored in communications and political science and made good use of his time at WSU. At Daily Evergreen, he was an opinion editor, a managing editor, and finally an editor-in-chief before graduating. So let's get started with the program. Just wanted to quickly notify everyone that Rita is actually in a remote area today, and in case her audio breaks up, she's got a plan to call in with her landline, and we'll be able to continue to hear her. So Rita, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Rita Kepner, and I did earn my PhD there on campus. I believe that most students have two main goals for their education. One of them is to be able to earn a living, and the other one is to do that in a way that's enjoyable, ethical, and makes a difference in the world. Crisis communication is a relatively new subset of public information and public relations. The Public Relations Society of America formed in about 1908, about 1945, and it was their focus, and still is their focus, to be corporate public relations. You're going to hear more about that from Gavin, from Mr. Mathis. Well, I also did some work for commercial businesses, some PR work. My focus has mainly been public affairs and public information, and mostly about government programs and services. My personal crisis communication education was OJT, on the job training, on the ground, in the field. If you are interested in pursuing this line of work, you are at one of the best places to learn the skills that you're going to be needing. And I can tell you that although it sounds a little boring, public information, it can be adventurous, exciting, and very fulfilling. You can make a difference in the world. As Margaret said, I have personally taken part in 74 nationally declared catastrophic events. She gave you some examples, and I would include the Oklahoma City bombing and the Exxon Valdez oil spill in addition. I've also been on the ground for earthquakes, floods, wildfires, and one airplane crash. I've had the opportunity to do media escort, flying in helicopters over floods, arriving with my team in a military chartered plane on a runway with no control tower because it had been blown down. I have a colleague that flew from Puerto Rico to Florida to wait out a hurricane, and then rode in a military ship to get back from Florida to Puerto Rico. Another time he got to even fly in a military Osprey. really cool. So there are potential adventures involved in providing public information to people in need. One time I was live on television and had an uncomfortable opportunity to figure out how to correct the Vice President of the United States, who had just made a minor technical error, which I knew would confuse disaster survivors. And I actually was a disaster survivor myself once, and I know how important it is to have good information. Over time, I calculated that I had one-on-one interactions, often live on the air, you know, CNN with the mic in your mouth, with an estimated 8,000 individual media representatives. As a public information officer and spokesperson, my job was to inform them about how the laws worked to help disaster survivors and to protect taxpayer dollars while encouraging people to prepare for next time. I know that many media representatives subscribe to the Society of Professional Journalists who incorrectly insists that public information spokespersons, public affairs officers, and public relations people are barriers to their information. In fact, my goal has always been to supply timely, accurate information to survivors in need. Listening to survivor stories may be one of the hardest parts of the job. I listened to the tragedy of a Black grandmother tell of losing her daughter and only grandchild to the actions of a white supremacist anti-government bomber. She gave me a homemade cookie. I interviewed an Army colonel in tears who was helping clean oil from a previously pristine Alaska beach near his military base. It had been one of the favorite areas for fishing and clamming, and he could see that it would not be whole again for many decades. I helped arrange funeral funding for a family that lost 2 babies in a sudden flash flood. The sudden river water pulled the babies from the arms of the family member babysitting those children. Using some poor Spanish, I interacted with traumatized people struggling to survive in Puerto Rico after the Category 5 Hurricane Maria flattened almost everything growing. People needed to know how to find clean drinking water and blue tarps to stay dry. They needed accurate, timely public information during crisis. That's crisis communication. In the years preceding my return to college to work for my advanced degree, I began seeing some changes in how media representatives were responding to my request to put out essential crisis information for survivors. I chose to use the tool of research to try to understand why media representatives seemed newly resistant to sharing the urgently needed public information. I knew that something had changed, leaving innocent people in need. My research showed that FCC rules had changed and that our commercial for-profit media are now allowed to use infotainment as a substitute for news or public information. As infotainment increased, factual news decreased and inaccuracies decreased. So media outlets would remove boring facts like the addresses for a water distribution center. Addresses are not as infotaining as the descriptions of people suffering or dying from lack of clean drinking water. My dissertation in part narrates how I came to discover the FCC changes. Some of you will find opportunity to read it. I hope so. It's on file online and there at the Pullman Library. After the process of study and defending my dissertation, I went back to the field to continue what I know as the public affairs or public information officer ethical obligation to help disaster survivors by supplying facts and information. I feel personally rewarded when helping those in true need. I also decided to use my newfound education to work with my home community in Jefferson County to change how my local radio station representatives could interact with county emergency management and the public. Yesterday, the Seattle Times reported that Jefferson County had the highest percentage of fully vaccinated people in Washington state. I want to tell you a bit more about that and about the COVID-19 virus crisis management teamwork. And I'll do that in a few minutes. Next, I want you to listen carefully to hear from Mr. Mathis about completely different, other exciting aspects of this complex field of crisis communication. Listen carefully and know that the skills you're learning there are the ones you're going to need if you choose to go into this field.
Rita, why don't we take a couple of questions right now? We've got a few coming in through the chat. Emily wants to know, what is the most rewarding part of working in this profession despite the amount of loss and sadness that goes along with it?
That's actually pretty easy. It's knowing that you have made a difference in the lives of people who have been damaged through no fault of their own. These are good people, most always doing the right things, making good choices, and circumstances make their lives miserable. If you can do something to make their lives better, that's awesome.
It's very great. And Dana wants to know, from Heather, I'm sorry, how do you find the emotional strength to deal with these crises?
That's a really good question and very important. It does take a lot of emotional strength. I've had good friends and good counseling, which I have taken advantage of on and off over the years. I have a list of non-negotiables when I'm out in the field. I always eat good food, not junk. So good food, some sleep, some exercise. Those are my 3 non-negotiables every day. And I have had the incredible fortune of living in an area where when I do come home and have downtime, it's clean and beautiful downtime where I can recenter and think things through. It's very important to know yourself and to know when you're feeling chipped at, so you can fix those chips before they become big cracks.
Let me ask you one more question, Rita, and then we'll move on to Gavin. I was really struck by what you said about your experience in Puerto Rico and knowing that people, what they really wanted to know was, where do they find clean drinking water? Like, where are the blue tarps? And so when you're working in this field, is your primary audience, again, the people who are victims of a disaster, and what channels are you typically using to try to provide information to them if you're in a disaster area such as Hurricane Maria, where power lines were down and there was no electricity? So how do you work with those kinds of obstacles to get information to these folks?
That is a very astute question, Margaret, because in crisis communication, there are multiple audiences, and not all the audiences are the survivors who need the information. Some of the audiences are indeed people who only need infotainment, and they're good with that. So Maria was particularly difficult and exhausting because of just what you said. We didn't have power, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have internet. Some places we had no phones. But the tools that we used are the ones that I will be describing in the second part of my presentation, where I talk about different models of communication. And the answer to that is you might have to be as complex as one-on-one in the field. You might be going to churches and groups and asking them to pass information one-on-one. And of course, you use every teensy smidgen of the software and electronic tools that may be available to you.
Gotcha. All right. This is fantastic so far. So thank you so much, Rita. We look forward to hearing from you again. And so now let's hear from Gavin Mathis.
Well, thank you, Rita. That was just fascinating. When we first started chatting about what this panel was going to be a few weeks ago, I thought I was probably going to be presenting a case study about a juicy crisis comm scenario for a previous client. But sometimes those are difficult to walk through. And given the topic we ended up on, this communicating in times of crisis, I wanted to pull a case study from the last year. And obviously, given everything that happened in 2020 with COVID, social unrest, the election, there was no shortage of interesting case studies. And I want to pull one up here about, I was actually a Sabre Award finalist for a client named Domo. They're a data analytics company based outside the Salt Lake City area. And they created this, a data platform that was used by a number of states, including Utah, Iowa, Nebraska, and a number of private sector companies to make kind of inform a lot of their decisions. And I wish I could take credit for coming up with the creation of this platform, but they're just an incredible data analytics company. They had these tools, resources, and they went to work immediately after the pandemic hit, and they wanted to find out how can we use our technology to help state governments, help private companies make more informed decisions and allocate resources appropriately. Then it fell on the method team and Domo's communication team to increase the profile of this tool, of this technology, and how it was helping so many states and so many companies across the country. So what we did was we tried to leverage, at first we started pitching this out as a resource for reporters, say, hey, you're writing a story about COVID. This data might be of interest to you if you're tracking numbers in a particular market. We pitched local media. And what ended up happening was more and more, we got a lot of tier one media that was interested in the technology itself, not so much the data, kind of changing from day to day, because Johns Hopkins, the CDC, they all had tremendous resources as well. They're more interested in the customer case studies, how were governors using this technology, what decisions were being made, and just kind of what things were changing from day to day using this technology. So we actually got far better coverage for Domo than we ever planned. We were expecting one little sentence about state numbers increased by X% according to data analytics platform Domo. Instead, we would have the headline: Domo or analytics platform helps Utah deliver COVID relief, something along those lines, which was fantastic for the client. We got coverage in Fox News, Mad Money. We had a segment with the CEO, Josh James, went on Mad Money with Jim Cramer, and Cramer said it was one of the best COVID trackers or COVID dashboards he had seen. And it was that type of earned media coverage that really helped Domo sell this product to new customers. And I think they saw like a 5X increase in their website traffic just from the Jim Cramer appearance on Mad Money. And that just goes to show you, how important earned media can be during a situation like that. I can't imagine how much spend it would have been in terms of advertising dollars, marketing dollars, social media spend to get that type of traffic to a website. But one small appearance on a national television show was able to help Domo really highlight their product and communicate to an even broader audience. I think we were able to get about 173 pieces of coverage, which was just fantastic given who Domo is. They're a competitor to like Tableau, which is a Salesforce company, and AWS, Amazon Web, which is Amazon's kind of product in this space. So we were competing with much, much larger companies, but able to get them some incredible news coverage. And we were so honored to get this Sabre nomination because we were in the same company as I think Budweiser, Motion Picture Association. So all the big movie studios, Sony, Paramount, and others. That's just not something that is easy to do. We had to kind of punch above our weight a little bit and find unique ways to tell this story and get earned media coverage for Domo to break into some of these big conversations around the pandemic. And just to circle back a little bit to the importance of data and why some of the findings, Rita made this point as well about this disconnect between, a lot of the data that was coming out of the CDC, Johns Hopkins, Domo's platform. I think it's just interesting to compare, what the numbers were actually showing versus the coverage we were actually seeing. There was a recent Dartmouth study that some of you may have seen that New York Times did a nice little write-up on it a couple of weeks ago, just showing how negative, news media coverage was in the US, or national news media coverage was. I think it was like 87 to 90% of national news media coverage of the pandemic was negative in 2020. Obviously, it was absolutely terrible story, but you would expect that to kind of ebb and flow with the data as cases rose and fell, but that wasn't really the case. And this was just kind of an interesting learning example for me to go through, because there were a lot of positive stories that come out of this. I remember pitching a healthcare reporter about for a telehealth client, not Domo, another one. They had a platform that was being used by a lot of hospitals to coordinate care, communicate directly with patients, and we handed the story to a reporter kind of on a silver platter, with the hospital, with the patient, with the technology provider, and the reporter kind of bluntly say, it's too early to say, we've figured this out, or that there are green shoots, or there's any positives in the story. We were seeing tons of really compelling kind of Dunkirk moments. In fact, in Salt Lake, the CEO of Domo, he was an investor in a company called Stance Socks, and they pretty quickly turned from making socks to PPE equipment, and they helped deliver a shipment of PPE very early on in the pandemic. And it was delivered, flew into Salt Lake City. We were able to coordinate a press conference for Governor Gary Herbert and the CEO, Josh James. There were a lot of moments like that I think just didn't get the attention they probably deserved. And it's interesting to see over the last year what we expected this platform to be and how it was going to be used, and then how it actually ended up getting news coverage instead. I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but if we want to move to the next slide here, if you can, I want to run through just a few quick do's and don'ts. We learned a lot of lessons in 2020 about crisis comms and what worked and what didn't. Obviously, a lot of these have to do with social media content. I think you see a lot of customers, or a lot of our clients, who don't go don't push the stop button on their social media when a terrible crisis like the pandemic, or we're in the middle of protests, or you see, like, the worst example would be like an airline crash happening, and they continue to post the same social media content about sales and your trip to Cancun or Bermuda. Unfortunately, that does happen, and it just needs to be one of the first things you do is push a quick pause on and look back at all the content you have scheduled to go out. It just makes you look incredibly tone deaf if you don't do that. Second one, plan some more. I mean, I think probably the majority of the plans that we do for clients, crisis communication plans, are thankfully never used. But there are equal number of times where we're called in, a day or two after something has happened, a data breach at a company, or I can remember a restaurant chain had a video go out where an employee was caught kind of spitting in a person's food, and by the time you're calling in your agency and you haven't planned for that, it's already too late. I think if we'd worked with that restaurant chain prior to the incident, that would have been one of the first 2 or 3 incidents you would obviously think about. If you're head of PR at a restaurant, you're thinking about a health issue at your facility, what your exec is saying, or something like that. And it's just being able to quickly put these plans into action. And fortunately, a lot of clients that we worked with, just didn't have that over the last year when they had to learn kind of on the fly. And in 2020, I think the biggest thing that changed was just the role of internal communications. I think I tend to overlook the importance of it, but suddenly this year, everyone had to become an expert in it, because we were communicating to employees almost primarily. That was one of the biggest key audiences. I think, it's really sexy to work in PR and hobnob with reporters and work with media and big stakeholders and things like that. But at the end of the day, you can't forget about core audiences like your customers, like your employees. And suddenly everyone was dealing with the exact same problem in 2020, which was, what are we going to do? We're all working remotely. How do we go through this process? And, we were learning lessons from our own clients as well about, okay, when are people going back to work? How are they handling this? Should we do this the same way? So yeah, internal comms just became a huge thing in 2020, and I expect it to be the same moving forward, more and more important as the workforce becomes more and more remote. Clear chain of command and just have a small circle of decision makers is another one that I always advise clients to think about. A former client of mine, she had run PR at Yahoo when they had their data breach, and I think the lesson she learned was, she said, I wish I just put the CEO, our general counsel, and then probably myself and one individual in a room and locked the door so we could have figured something out right away. There were just too many voices in a lot of these situations, and a lot of that noise needs to be eliminated. And then, you need to have a clear chain of command in terms of what we're going to do, who needs to approve this, and who's going to say who to say what to who. Don't sacrifice accuracy for efficiency. I think there's a lot of people who just want to get a quick response out there, and but it's just as important to be accurate about it. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I need to circle back to you. I know Jen Psaki, the press secretary, gets a lot of flack for saying that so often, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with trying to get your the ideal response and then circling back to a reporter with it. I think you see far more problems when you're speaking out of turn and just trying to get some response out, even if it's not the best response possible. Develop a war room. I think it's probably just because of my political background that I have this mindset and try to bring it with a lot of clients, because I don't want to let any accusation go unchecked, and especially stop the spread of misinformation, which is probably my new biggest fear with a lot of clients. When something you can just be posted on Twitter doesn't need to be accurate, but it oftentimes warrants a response. So it's just being able to work quickly and respond to anything that is actually going to be a crisis and not just a small issue for your customer or client. Communicate early and often. I think it's pretty obvious. And then I think the biggest mistake I saw a lot of companies make in 2020 was just not actually following up on a lot of the words they spoke. You need to show that you care, take action. During on the social unrest last summer with the Black Lives Matter protest, I think it was easy for companies to put up a black square on Instagram, and then they didn't do anything. They didn't sign, a parity pledge. They didn't start looking at, actually bringing more female execs into their company, more people of color into their company. To circle back to Domo, I give them a lot of credit because they signed both parity pledge promises, and they now have a board that is 40% female, and they've made a lot of progress. And I think a lot more companies need to do the types of things that Domo has done, really put their really take action. And on the don't side, obviously, a lot of these are very, focused on how do you respond, or how your social media channels should reflect the ongoing challenges you're facing, and whether it's, public media, on social media, wherever it is. I think the most important one is probably don't feed the trolls, people who are attacking you on social media. I think this is something I stop a lot of clients from doing is, someone tweets something terrible about them and they just want to respond. They want to call a press conference. And this, in fact, did happen to a client. They were asking us to, respond to. There was a very small criticism about the security of their platform, and they wanted to call a gigantic press conference to refute the claims. And we had to tell them, this is one small blog making this claim. We're going to make this far, far worse if we respond, with a press conference and invite Forbes and Fortune and every trade media reporter under the sun to this thing. No one cares about this, but they're suddenly going to care about it if we end up, making a big deal out of this. And thankfully they didn't do it, and there was no press conference. And it kind of just went away after a day or two. But you really don't. You have to practice a lot of, much like doctors. You have your first rule should be do no more harm, and then a lot of the exterior forces that are working against you. I think a lot of clients kind of shoot themselves in the foot. They overreact, or they're just too slow to actually deal with the crisis that's kind of pending or that they're dealing with. And of course, it just you're working with key stakeholders within your organization, whether that's legal or sales or whatever department where the crisis may have occurred. Whether it's your someone who's out there on selling product door to door, who may have said something to a customer and that has become a crisis, or you can only imagine the types of situations that happen within organizations. So just back to my original point is just plan for all these things. I mean, I think it's easy to be caught flat-footed, but so many crisis situations just don't need to happen. With the right PR support, you can anticipate them and even get ahead of them. I think that kind of covers a lot of things I want to do, but I'm happy to answer any questions and open up for any Q&A.
Thanks so much, Gavin. This is fantastic. We've got quite a few questions that have come in. Alana asked, what drove you to make the move from working in PR and politics to agency work?
I was kind of forced to, because my boss at the time, Max Bacchus, decided to retire. He wasn't going to run for office again. So that was a pretty quick pivot I had to make there. And I think that's often the case. I mean, I had a lot of friends and colleagues who, worked on the Hill, and their boss just happens to lose an election and they're out of the job come November, and they need to quickly kind of find something else. And, thankfully I had a little more time, and a few folks helped me kind of move into tech PR, and I lobbied for some tech companies after leaving the Hill. I think that probably is the case for a lot of individuals, and it's a great experience. I encourage everyone to work in the public sector, and I think it's one of the most rewarding jobs I had. But yeah, it's definitely not the same job security as working in an agency or in the private sector.
Yeah. Sean wants to know, as we have seen in the past year, misinformation during a crisis can prove to be deadly. How have the tactics of crisis communication changed in response to this?
Tactical is an interesting one. I was definitely thinking about the tools being used. I mean, we use Meltwater and Trendkite to spot, blips on social media a great deal. I mean, a lot of the channels are still the same. I think people tend to underutilize social media. It's the first place I go when, there's an issue with my airline, an issue with whatever. I want to know something. I want some sort of update. I'm never going to the press release section of some company's website to get a statement. You're going to find it somewhere else much faster. And there's an appropriate response or appropriate message to be put out on social media. There's an appropriate one for a press release, for a press conference, for everything, for pre-recorded video from your CEO. It just kind of depends on the situation, and it's just using the appropriate medium for whatever message it is, and the timing.
Great. Actually, this is a question, I think, Gavin, that you even suggested. What are the crisis comms challenges facing PR professionals in 2021 and further out into the future?
I definitely go back to my point about internal comms. It was something I always ignored. I think it's going to be more and more important. So folks who are interested in that specific field, I think there's, a lot of opportunities for you. And then I think the other fear of mine, or thing I'm thinking about going forward, is just misinformation and how you respond to it. Watching the election last year was obviously a concern. And, when you see studies like the MIT one a few years ago about false information spreading, I think it's 6 times faster. It reaches 1,000. Most true stories don't reach 1,000 people, or I think it's 6 times faster. It'll reach 1,000 people, or a false story will reach 1,000 people 6 times faster than a true one, which is kind of scary to think. And very few true stories reach more than 1,500 people. It's the false ones that will reach 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people on social media. So it is just being able to respond to those. And how do social media companies? I don't have an answer to it about how do you mark something that is not accurate information. How do you kind of create a good environment for public discourse and dialogue, but ensure that the information on those platforms is accurate. I don't have a good answer to it. I'm glad I'm not Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg, but there's clearly a problem, and brands need to be ready for that.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll turn it over to Rita for her second part of the presentation. Tricia asked, any tips for communicating during a crisis where your guiding principle is transparency, but you may not be able to share details? In other words, like an airline crisis and the federal government legally restricts what information you can communicate.
I always think it's fine to say, this is an ongoing legal matter. We can't comment on certain aspects, but it's trying to show, when you can't disclose some information, it becomes far more important to be, emotional, make sure you're showing that you care about, those who are affected, the actions that are being taken. If you can't disclose something, you can still say, what we are doing to remedy this problem, to fix this problem. I think that is always far more important than just kind of the end solution or some of the basic information while you're trying to figure it out. Is, hey, we are taking actions to remedy this situation. I think that matters the most.
Yeah, cool. Great. Thank you, Gavin. And there are a bunch of other questions for you that I'll wait until the very end of the program to ask you, so that Rita has plenty of time for her presentation. So turning it back over to you, Rita.
Okay, well, Gavin, thank you. Yeah, that was a huge bunch of wonderful information, and I hope students were taking careful notes. It was great. So ditto everything, everything that he said. I want to offer a kind of a case study. I would like to talk to you about Jefferson County, Washington, and I'll start by saying that statistics are one attempt to be able to show that crisis communication can be effective, but it may be more complicated than we think. I want to frame my discussion here by showing you some communication models. The first model is a long-standing communication model. I think it's on the screen, you can see it there. It shows a source, a communication tool, which is often the media or called a medium, and that relays the message to an audience. That's a simple conceptual tool, but it rarely works for crisis communication. In fact, it rarely works for most messaging. It's just lovely, but doesn't work. The second model, so slide 2, the second model is closer to current circumstances. A crisis communicator, an emergency management specialist or scientist, whoever, relays information to a medium, but most people are now getting their information some other way. You're not necessarily getting it through the media that you're trying to use, whichever one that happens to be. The third model is the third model is potentially a useful model. That shows that this educated, vetted information source is sending the correct crisis communication information to normal media, plus a complexity of other communication vehicles, to include social media and the internet. These messages can be relayed to multiple receivers. However, the same message, the wording, may or may not be the same, and the scientific principles may not be accurate, and the same as came from the original vetted sources. Please note that in my third model, there are some people who are not getting that information at all. Little box of people at the end. For purposes of our discussion, those people might be the ones who are low income, who do not have internet, do not have television. They may not speak any language that is being used to send information. They might be deaf or blind, or have some other kinds of barriers to communication. Figure 4 is a much more complex and dynamic model. It's the one that we tried to use with the COVID-19 virus team in Jefferson County, Washington. This model has two-way communication. They are sending and receiving information through the media, including social media, and through individuals, and messages are getting to some of the people that we missed in the earlier models. So this is very complicated. It's two-way. It goes back and forth, and frankly, hard to manage, but that's the one that works. My years in the field have taught me that one important part of crisis communication is that feedback from survivors. You need to know if your target audience did or did not get the information you were trying to send. And if they got it, you need to know whether it was correct or not. It's critically important. Recent technology has added multiple methods for getting feedback from the multiple layers of players that take part in crisis communication. Gavin mentioned those, to include social media monitoring. There's a variety of hardware, software tools that can help. It's a long-standing concept that crisis communication needs to be fast, needs to be transparent, we mentioned transparency, and directly answer the questions that the various stakeholders have. In normal public relations or public information communication, you might have a plan, a strategy to give a piece of information, but give it one piece at a time. In crisis communication, the urgency will force you to be spreading information on multiple levels all at the same time. The next most important part of crisis communication in my mind is trust. The people listening to the information, wherever they got it, however they got it, must trust the source. The best crisis information plan with the clearest goals will fail without trust. For the COVID-19 case in my community, we agreed that the main goal was to save lives. We talked about planning and goal setting and all that. So this is all these things that Gavin mentioned, all these things are background into what I'm going to continue to say here. I can give you some facts. So far, in Jefferson County, Washington, only 2 people have died from COVID, 2 in the entire county. And those 2 apparently came from out of county visiting. Jefferson County has the highest fully vaccinated percentage, about 30%, about twice as high as the state average. And it's second to the lowest in the rate of cases, compared to the highest county case, which is 12%. Enormous differences. We had earlier started to construct, in this county, we had earlier started to construct a trust and transparency system. So this had been in progress for a long time before COVID-19 came upon us. Our emergency manager had agreed to allow a meeting of local media to discuss how we could all work together in case of a major disaster. We had assumed as a coastal community that a big tsunami would be our worst case scenario. It was a lengthy process for people to get to know each other and begin to trust each other. The Emergency Management Office required that media representatives take FEMA Incident Command System training to earn badges that would allow them into the Emergency Operations Center during a catastrophic event. The ICS training emphasizes the legal requirements for individual privacy, chain of command within the Operations Center, all those things that Gavin talked about, which are important in general and certainly important in crisis communication. A few media representatives dropped out. Some local radio station volunteers worked hard to gain badge access to be allowed in and out of the EOC to be embedded during catastrophic events. They came to understand the organizational structure. They could see the reasoning behind the complex decisions made at the Operations Center. In the time we have, I cannot describe all the steps, but when COVID-19 hit Jefferson County, we were able to contact our local doctor, a local community doctor, who agreed to allow the radio station to broadcast live the full briefing of information given to our community elected officials. Totally transparent. I would like to offer my Jefferson County statistics as one attempt to show that crisis communication can be effective. So, let me get to my last page, trust and transparency. The communication team constructed the weekly radio broadcast so that anyone in the extended listenership could give questions to the doctor and to the emergency management. That's my timer going off, sorry. My emergency management officer, Willie Bentz, at the end of every community briefing. The Emergency Management Center also used software called Nixle, social media organizations called Nextdoor to invite people to listen to the briefings live every Monday morning. Many individuals reached out to friends and family to share what they had learned. In this way, friends and family of people with disabilities, homebound, and other challenged audiences not normally reached heard from friends and family, people they knew and trusted, and everyone had questions. Some questions made sense. Others were clearly rooted in conspiracy theory and other forms of misinformation or disinformation. After each medical briefing, Dr. Tom Locke respectfully answered those questions accurately. Trust and transparency. So you heard the facts, only 2 people died. Our goal was to protect lives. But we've not done any kind of proper research study to actually prove that this crisis communication model and the structure that we used was what made a difference. If there's a student out there would like a project to research this particular case study, I'd love to be a mentor. And with that, questions.
Sorry, Rita. That's really fascinating, Rita. What really remarkable outcome so far to really building that trust and involving the news media in training. That's really, really exciting. Let me ask you this. I'm thinking a little bit back to your model. So what changes do you think are needed to ensure, though, that more people are going to be able to receive critical information in a pending or an ongoing disaster? Because it does look as if the velocity of disasters around the world and in their country seems to be intensifying. So is it expanding broadband access? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. We live in a horribly complicated world, but I think my thoughts are pretty straightforward. Start local, think global. We have to do this work. If it's important, whether it's, climate change or people dying of COVID-19, the communication that works is local. And then it spreads and it multiplies. As Gavin said, the negative goes farther and faster. I think I read somewhere too that where if you get a piece of information incorrectly, no, I have to go back. If you get a piece of information correctly, it takes 7 repetitions to get it embedded in your brain. So if we can stop incorrect at less than 7, we're ahead. But if you get a piece incorrectly and it's stuck there after 7 repetitions, the research shows it takes 7 times 7 to correct it. So for crisis information, the goal is act fast and make sure that they get correct information from trusted sources the first through 7 times. There is some room to get in there and make corrections, but boy, it has to be fast and it has to be from very trusted sources. And our most trusted sources are the people that we know and interact with. One of the reasons that a lot of the conspiracy theory systems have worked is because they built little local groups of trusted sources. So we need to be able to build little local groups of trusted sources, whether it's about crisis communication or even in fact about, corporations that are selling products. It's still going to be the individual that I shouted out to yesterday in the driveway saying that the roofing material that I just had to put on my roof that got damaged in the storm was good.
Wow.
So the one-on-one stuff, I think, is the critical component.
Sounds like an analog solution in a digital age, doesn't it? Well,
I think we need to, I agree,
Yeah.
we need to use every tool. And I think we need those digital tools, but those digital tools still, telephone is a digital tool. Well, it's a kind of one-on-one.
Right.
The phones, they kind of intuitively use their phones for text messaging rather than emails or other group messaging. When people intuitively know that this is a good way to get trusted information is from people you trust.
Yeah. Well, let me go back. I've got a few questions that are continuing to roll in here. A few questions from earlier. One to Gavin. Could you speak more about the methodology behind tailoring your messaging on public platforms? In other words, what's the best way to explain how we should communicate differently on platforms like internal, blog, and so forth?
I was muted there. I think it's probably just the limitations of the platform itself. Quickly social media. I'd give an example of a hospital chain we worked with. They used a lot of social media to, reach people who already followed them, and to direct them to more to better resources on their own channels, on their own website. But we actually, the PR side, we were able to help them reach a far broader audience by holding press conferences, by getting them to, getting doctors and professionals to speak to media about mental health during times of COVID, things like that, and just reaching a much bigger audience outside of their own followers. But yeah, I think it's just purely the limitations of the medium, and there's not, software or any particular, way of going about that. I think of how I pick one over the other is just what is the length of this message? What is the, what's being communicated here? And let's find the best medium to do that. The only thing I would maybe add on is just, I tend to use HubSpot a lot, which is a great tool to tailor your pitches a bit to media. I'll do a little A/B testing of like, why does this subject line get far much better open rate on this topic than this subject line does? And it's just kind of using those tools a little bit to refine your message and seeing what's really resonating with media. What's, why do they care about this more than something else? I think that's probably the best advice I could give.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question for Rita. So how has social media played a role in managing disaster communication? More specifically, how have you seen social media change the landscape for how you communicate with publics during a major disaster?
It's important for underline. It's important, and it keep in mind. Remember when I said that getting information embedded in your brain takes 7 repetitions, but they don't all have to come from the one most trusted source in your life. Those 7 times can come from a variety of social media, can come from classical media, broadcast media, can come from any sources, then they add up to the 7. But the trust component is enforced when some of them at least are people that you know. And then if the information is echoed across all of these different methods of communication, then that's far better. So please don't misunderstand when I say that one-on-one and trust in people you know. I don't mean that to be, in fact, analog. I mean that to be a part of a very complex system that goes back and forth. It includes one-on-one, but all of these new tools that we have available to us are awesome. But, as Gavin said, I'm glad I'm not, Facebook or, Amazon or any of these people having big troubles right now, Google, because it is so complicated. And they did develop software that intentionally connected trust people to trust people. That was the point. And that's why some of the misinformation worked so well. We live in a complicated, difficult time. So I'm hoping that, by having these discussions, we can all put some pressure on the creators of the complex software writing, so that that can be corrected, so that it does allow us to share correct information quickly, especially if it's, life-threatening information like COVID-19, but, any other kind of misinformation. The whole PR world doesn't want their CEO attacked for the wrong reasons, for the wrong, to be completely incorrect and totally dismantle the business. We need to keep working all together to get these complicated systems to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that really quick, it is a little scary that algorithms are designed basically to feed you the next story that you'll enjoy, will confirm your opinion, that will get you to stay on the platform longer. The purpose of these is so that you stay on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, longer, so that they can use those statistics to sell advertising space. It's not to get you the best information, most accurate information, to get you a variety of viewpoints. So there is going to, a healthy conversation is definitely needed about the type of content and how it's distributed on these platforms, because it is anyone who's seen The Social Dilemma, it is a little frustrating to see that, and just how that ends up taking over your life, and you're just seeing the same things over and over again to confirm one point of view or the other. And to Rita's earlier point and mine about the negative media coverage and how that kind of impacted the pandemic, I honestly just see cable news coverage as entertainment. I really see very little of it as very informative, and a lot of that needs to hopefully change. I mean, that study that I mentioned included like Politico and the New York Times, and I appreciate the New York Times kind of reflecting on and saying, hey, we had a lot of negative news coverage. We took a look at this, and it's interesting data that we need to be cognizant of, because what we ended up covering over the last year did have a very huge impact. So I appreciated their little response about it, because they kind of took some responsibility for what they were choosing to cover over the last year.
This has been fantastic. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Rita, so much. Our time is up. It's hard to believe we could keep talking about this for another hour or two or three. Thank you so much for participating in the session and sharing your insights. It's really been a great program. Just want to let the audience know that there are lots of exciting sessions and panels still to come later on today and tomorrow, and we hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.